This PowerPoint is help for Chapter 6 in Tozer, and it is our wrap-up in our conversation about scientific rationality and school reform. The connection here is the modern liberal ideology and how it impacted the different educational experiences during the progressive era. So some of the key ideas that we should understand is that it's not just a modern liberal perspective, but also the interests, the material benefits or material concerns that are connected to ideology. And putting those two together can help us understand better some of the policy decisions and strategies during this time period. For example, there's a contradiction in the treatment of race depending on which group you're speaking of. For African Americans, a lot of their history during the progressive era is an educational history of being excluded or prevented from accessing public schooling. Whereas for American Indians, it's the opposite, where students were resisting that inclusion and were actually forced to go to school. So the inconsistency there, even though both are influenced by racial ideology, can be explained through the different interests that are involved. For African Americans, quite often an exclusion from schooling is tied to subordination in the labor market and in broader society, as well as a subordination in terms of political participation. For American Indians, forced inclusion was part of a broader strategy of assimilation that would undermine the treaty rights and the specific political status of tribal nations as sovereign nations. So from that standpoint, forced assimilation was the goal for American Indians, this idea that we will break you down into individuals rather than members of a politically specific group. Whereas for African Americans, without that same political status, the marginalization was the more overt strategy. But in both cases, race influenced the perspective and the decision to marginalize, and it was simply a different strategy about how to achieve that marginalization or that undermining of rights and status. So for American Indians, that recognition of sovereignty, that understanding that American Indians are political groups with a nation-to-nation relationship to the federal government is key to understanding American Indian education and why boarding schools were the strategy for a great deal of this historical period. So to revisit some of the main concepts in the progressive era before we step into American Indian education, scientific rationality and this idea of a cult of experts is important. And scientific rationality, if you remember, is a heavy reliance on a particular narrow method of discovering and validating knowledge, and for having very particular processes for action and problem solving. And the idea is the people who are trained in that way of thinking and that way of acting were most fit to govern or make decisions. And the result of that was a centralization of governance and bureaucracy, moving decisions out of the hands of the average person in a lot of ways, and a rationale for government intervention. The idea that the cult of experts had the right to intervene and even the responsibility to intervene in order to solve problems. The other thing we're seeing with increasing industrialization during this time period is that schools are more and more being modeled on business. We saw that with Taylorization, the way in which a factory model for handling labor and production influenced the model of schools in terms of breaking down tasks, making things more heterogeneous and complex, emphasizing a large bureaucracy. In both cases, standardization becomes a model for increased efficiency. And again, we see this hierarchical top-down decision-making model with a cult of experts on top. And last, the progressive reformers were very much into this idea of intervening to solve problems, and schools were often a mechanism to do so. From a scientific rationality perspective, they were logically saying schools are a place where we can teach people certain behaviors or certain actions, and that is what is going to allow us to solve the problem we would like to solve. So if you want a visual to kind of imagine the hierarchy of scientific management, this is probably a good way to think of it. If you notice on the bottom, there are the two strands of progressive education: developmental democracy and social efficiency. And you can see there that one is dependent on marginalization of political rights and distribution of economic opportunity that is not equal. And then the other, developmental democracy, is much more about teaching people political participation and how to self-govern, but within the current status quo and the current arrangement of the institutions. So for natural law, we can see that was another big influence, and that, again, we're rationalizing a hierarchy or a top-down model of decision-making, where the cult of experts would be the elite, the people on top. And we can see that they rationalize this through the newest version of natural law, which is social Darwinism, or this idea of a survival of the fittest, that progress is not guaranteed, that the people who are most capable of progressing do so, and that it's a competition. So from that standpoint, the outcome that is unequal is explained as effort or worth, which means that it's a meritocratic explanation. It's saying that people rise or fall based on their own personal effort or merits, and not saying that the system is a stacked deck, which is usually a little more accurate. So with probable destiny then in natural law, it appears contradictory in this idea that nothing is guaranteed, and then probable destiny is saying, actually, we're assuming we know where you'll end up. But that's where the racial ideology and often the economic ideology come into play, where you assume that if someone is poor, they are less fit to compete, and so they'll likely end up in a certain endpoint in this competition. Okay. So then for progress, we can see again this idea of you have to fight for it, you have to compete. And part of that competition then is marginalizing people who are, quote, less fit and letting the experts take over to lead you into better progress. So from that standpoint, scientific management rationalizes itself, that the people who are most fit to compete end up being in the cult of experts, and therefore they are most fit to fix these problems and lead everyone into progress. So for American Indians, this becomes very salient and very relevant because there was often a framework that positioned American Indians as, again, using the racial ideology, as behind, as less civilized, as less modern, less capable of moving forward. So from this standpoint, scientific rationality standpoint, this cult of experts is most fit to assimilate or educate American Indians into how to function in the modern world. So it becomes a mechanism. Schools become a mechanism for that transition. So with Collier in Chapter 6, if you remember, they talk about all of the different changes that he made to the really heavy-handed boarding school model, and how he introduced things like the indigenous languages or traditional crafts into school as a way to get indigenous children to be less resistant to this heavy-handed process of assimilation. The important thing to remember here is that the method changed, but the end goal stayed the same. What Collier was doing was a kinder, gentler assimilation, something that would undermine people's resistance and make it appear much more consensual. But the end point of assimilating the student is the same. They could either in the past be forced to read the Bible and go to church, or with Collier, teach them the Bible in their own language. But either way, the idea of moving into Christianity was there. So the reason why this is scientific is because it was a particular strategy, drawing on social science research, drawing on particular methods of problem solving. And so it was very deliberate. And that becomes an important understanding when we're trying to figure out the pros and cons of Collier's approach. But one of the ways in which we can recognize that it still wasn't as positive as it may have appeared on its face is that self-determination was not necessarily returned to the tribal nations. And what self-determination meant was still being defined through the eyes of the reformers rather than through the tribal nations. So from that perspective, if someone else keeps telling you, here's how you use your freedom, you're not necessarily as free as you would like to think.